How does an idea of the world arise in our minds? We can also ask ourselves, how does the world get into our brains? Or what does the world within our brains do with our new perception? As in the chapter about how our perception functions, in this video we will primarily learn something about ourselves. But we will also learn how to develop a better perception for the other person, how to prevent mistakes and misunderstandings both in intercultural encounters and in ordinary everyday interpersonal encounters. Let me start with a story as an example, the so-called kiss-kiss anecdote. This story was picked up by the psychologist Paul Watzlawick, but was first documented by the anthropologist and ethnologist Edward T.Hall. Edward T.Hall served as a soldier in World War II in the Pacific region and later in Europe. In 1944, large parts of Europe were occupied by Nazi Germany. The United States of America, amongst others, deployed large contingents of troops in Great Britain in preparation for the invasion of Normandy. The soldiers conducted maneuvers and drills, but of course they also had free time. At this time, the British hosts organized so-called dances. An example, events where the local population and the American soldiers came together to socialize, dance and to celebrate. It will probably come as no surprise to you that there were quite a few US-British relationships, engagements and marriages during this time. It is probably quite natural that when people meet each other, interpersonal contact and relationships arise. Although this phenomenon was a reason for Edward T. Hall's research in form of interviews, it was not really surprising to him. Instead, astonishment arose when he asked the US soldiers and the young British women how this rather unusual liaison came about. In the 1940s, people might marry a partner from the same town or the neighboring one. Marriages between people from far away and especially from other countries or another continent were rather unusual. When asked how this came about, how this relationship arose, many of Edward T. Hall's fellow soldiers replied that the British women were really hot-tempered and spirited. So they cited the behavior of the British women as the cause of the relationship that developed. The pattern of responses from British was very similar. The American took to it, and the US-American soldier, he got to the point very quickly. So both sides gave the other side the responsibility for the situation that arose. That raised the question, what was really going on? Americans and Brits roughly spoke the same language and were therefore able to converse with each other with relative ease. The cultural patterns were also very similar when it came to getting to know each other and flirting, an example, what was common in the respective cultures when young people of the opposite sex got to know each other. You are probably aware that behind most of the things we do in everyday life, there are certain patterns and processes that we follow rather subconsciously. A formal telephone call usually begins with a person being called saying their name and greetings. Then the person calling gives a name, greets, expresses a wish and, for example, asks for information. The person called gives this information after questions for which the calling person thanks, wishes a nice day and says goodbye. As this is very often the case in German telephone calls. You always, wish something nice. Similar patterns exist in every facet of life, similar structures. Also in the 1940s, there were certain patterns of flirtation that people followed subconsciously. As I said, these cultural patterns were roughly equivalent, except for one part, the kiss. and the meaning of a kiss in each culture was the source of the phenomenon observed by Edward T.Hall. While the conservative British society at this time, a kiss came very late and perhaps at position 25 in a flirting process. An example, after both had gotten to know each other and often done things together, after they perhaps had shared dreams and the woman had introduced the man to her parents, and of course after the parents had agreed to an engagement and so forth. In contrast, a kiss often occurred much earlier in the comparatively more liberal United States of this time. In the United States, there existed the possibility of a more casual boyfriend-girlfriend relationship before marriage, with hand-holding, kissing being common at a much earlier stage. I'm not speaking about a French kiss, I'm speaking about a brief kiss and, of course, no sexual contacts. Let's look at the misunderstanding in flirting behavior in detail. It may have started at one of these dances when one of the soldiers glanced at an English woman for a little too long. They exchanged a look and possibly a shy smile, followed by an introduction, a conversation, and perhaps they choked and laughed together, meeting a first, second, perhaps a third time. Then the American, following the typical flirting script in his culture, made an attempt to kiss the English woman, thereby skipping many steps that were common and required in British flirting culture. She responded either with a slap in his face, which abruptly ended the situation, or she kissed back, but much more passionately than the American would have expected. It was the first kiss of her life, a very special and unique moment, and therefore a highly engaged and passionate kiss. The US Americans kissed very early, which is why the British side gave them responsibility for the newly created situation. The English kissed more passionately than expected, which is why the British women were given responsibility for the escalation. We're talking here about the process of attribution, the explanation of the behavior of others through interpretation. Person A, let's call him Jack, behaves in a certain way. In our example, Jack is a soldier and he's attempting to kiss. Person B, let's call her Jane, notices what Jack is trying and seeks an explanation for Jack's actions. In example, Jack wants to engage with Jane. Most of the time, causes are looked for in the personality of the other person or in the situation, while cultural patterns are often seen as natural and thus not considered and taken into account. Now, this mental explanation from Jane perhaps matches the real motives for Jack's behavior. Then we would speak of an so-called isomorphic attribution. Or the explanation misunderstands the real causes. Then we speak of a misattribution. Based on the attribution, whether correct or incorrect, an evaluation is made by person B, by Jane. Now, our illustration depicts a rather linear process, which only describes a small part of communication. Person B, Jane, evaluates the actions of person A, Jack, an example, whether she finds this behavior appropriate or inappropriate. Based on this evaluation, Jane will then behave towards Jack again. So in our example, she would slap his face or kiss back. Jack will then react on Jane's behavior and will in turn look for causes and explanations. This process can actually be understood as a circular procedure, and it is very dynamic. If you've already seen the video on perception, you may have recognized the DIE formula in our illustration. DIE stands for describing, interpreting, and evaluating. We sensitize our perception by consciously reflecting on these three individual steps and questioning our interpretations. Let me summarize. Attribution means giving meaning, and ascription of meaning. Ascriptions are attributions that allow us to place social events in an understandable context. We follow an unconscious routine of perceiving and describing and interpreting and evaluating. We tend to evaluate the behavior of others. We all encounter misunderstandings and misattributions in our everyday lives, in our families and relationships where we have a shared cultural background and we have known each other for quite a long time. Now, how much more likely is a misunderstanding to take place when people have just met each other and come from different cultures? The social psychologist Robert Levine put it this way: we are motivated to find or invent, if necessary, an explanation for behavior that would otherwise make us feel stupid. What we see in the next image is a so-called mutual misattribution. In Kenya, as in Eastern Africa as a whole, showing your legs as a lady is a no-go. It would be understood as a sexual offer. Seeing these uncovered bare legs, the Kenyan woman perceives the German woman as shameless, whereas the German woman perceives the Kenyan woman as shameless because of her uncovered breasts. I would like to briefly mention the sociological theory of deviant behavior. At first, behavior is just behavior. Only when another person criticizes this behavior does it become deviant behavior. Both women, the Kenyan and the German, ascribe a quality to each other's clothing, relying on their respective cultural patterns as a standard of value. At this point, I would like to suggest 2 short films to illustrate the phenomenon of misattribution. While watching the films, ask yourself what circumstances played an important role in the perception of the main character, where the first attribution error occurred and how the cascade of subsequent errors continued. Both films last around 10 minutes each. The lunch date probably also inspired The Cookie Thief. Both films are linked below if you watch this video on YouTube. If you're watching via Moodle, Ilias or any learning platform, you will find the films in the module below. Now, let's move on to the so-called fundamental attribution error, a mistake that is deeply human, that we all make sooner or later to a greater or lesser extent. We tend to look for faults and bad qualities in others while keeping our own conscience clear. Consider a time at school or college when you got a bad grade. If you're not particularly self-critical, you may have blamed the bad grade on the teacher who narrowed down the material incorrectly or asked particularly difficult questions. If you got a good grade yourself, you may have seen your own personal qualities and talents as the cause for this good performance. We often see the bad grade of a classmate who's not so popular as being due to his supposedly bad qualities, while a good performance may be seen as a coincidence. He could have just been lucky. Let me summarize the so-called fundamental attribution error. We all have a tendency to evaluate ourselves more positively and others more negatively. When evaluating the behavior of strangers, we proceed in a mirror image. Our own behavior is excused by circumstances. We attribute our own positive results to our positive traits. From our point of view, the negative behavior of strangers is justified by their bad personality traits. Their positive results are put into perspective by favorable circumstances. Now, this fundamental attribution error exists not only between individuals but also in relation to groups. The communication psychologist Friedemann Schulz von Thun speaks of the so-called Obelix distortion. You may know Obelix's astonishment in every episode, which he justifies with the Romans are crazy. While the objective view from outside or from above sees many similarities between the one side and the other side and overlaps on both sides, one's own subjective view of others is completely different. The others appear to be pretty much the same, and the differences between them, they are minimized, which is also known in sociology as the phenomenon of outgroup homogeneity. This results in polarization, whereby the others and distant positions are seen as even further away and differences become exaggerated. Let me summarize briefly. In this video, we talked about the process of attribution and its circular and dynamic nature. We have covered mutual misattributions and the fundamental attribution error. You can find thematically related videos on the topics of perception and stereotype on YouTube or in your learning platform, an example on Moodle or on Ilias. Now, in this video on attribution, we talked a lot about how misattributions and attributions arise. We didn't talk about how stereotypes and prejudices can be broken down and how people learn interpersonally and interculturally and thereby benefit from diversity. On YouTube, I encourage you to leave your remarks in the comment section and to like and subscribe.